If you've been developing for any length of time, everyone's been given a card component like this. And maybe some designer has shown you, hey, you can toggle the badge on or off, or the image or the subtitle, and you can change around which image shows, or all this kind of stuff. And now it's your job to actually implement this in real code. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to use TypeScript and React. Now, if you've been paying close attention to the channel, you'll know that we actually built this entire thing out in Figma just like this. And so maybe you've been following along all the way from there, or maybe you're just jumping in. What we're going to do is build this out, this component right over here that uses the same kind of things. We can hide or show certain things. So for instance, we could hide the badge altogether and it just goes away. We could do the same thing with the image. We could hide that and it just disappears. We can obviously also change around the text. Anything we change in here will update dynamically in real time. We've also got components for the button, for instance. We could say like post or something like that. We can change around the icon. We can say whether or not the icon shows, or we can fill it, or we can hide it. All this is possible in React because we've created each of these things as separate little components that we can update in real time as we update our card component. All right, let's jump right in. All right, so as we get started here, let's just kind of familiarize ourselves with what this component can do. So if I were to drag out an instance by holding down the Option key and dragging it out, you can see that I've got a bunch of options over here on the side. And then there's also some nested options. So let's start with the nested options first. I've got this badge itself, and if I were to come in here, it's its own component. So I can decide whether or not it's filled, and then I can change the text over here. So that's the first thing to note. I also have another nested component, and that's this button down this way. Again, I've got options to fill it or to hide it. I can set it to primary or secondary. It looks like I didn't set that text to change quite properly. I can change around the text. I can show or hide the icon, and then I can choose a different icon if I'd like. So those are all things to keep in mind. And we'll build out those two first components before we do anything else. Next, I can also come in here, and I think this actually might be a component as well now that I think about it, but it's just changing out the text. So not too much to worry about there. If I click in here though, now I've got all these options. So I can show or hide the badge. I can show or hide the image as well if I want to. I can show or hide the subtitle. The indicator is also the same way. I can switch out the image as well. And then I can change up the text, the subtitle, and the body. So the text here is for the title, the body itself, or then if the subtitle is showing like that, then I can actually change out the subtitle. So those are all things to keep in mind as we get going, and we'll come back and reference this as we build things out. The next thing we're going to do though is get our project up and running. All right, so I'm over here in my terminal, and I'm going to go ahead and just type npm create vite, and then let's give this a title. Let's call it something like card component. All right, and that should start to scaffold this out for us. I do want this to be React, and let's go ahead and use TypeScript. And I'll card component, let's see, right here, and we'll just cd into that. All right, now I need to do npm install. All right, with that done, I'm going to actually open this up in VS Code and npm run dev in there. So I'll be right back with you. All right, here I am. I'm going to just hit Command J to open up the terminal here, and then I'll type npm run dev, and that should spin up a dev server that we can get going up right over here. So there we go. Count is, and I can move this up and down. Now I'm in dark mode right now on my machine, so I can switch to light mode, and that should, I think, adjust for me. No? Okay, well, either way, we're going to get rid of all that no matter what. So let's shut down this dev server, and let's go ahead and get rid of a few things we're not going to need. So let's see, if I come in here to my index.css, why don't we just, let's just scrap, I think we'll just scrap all of that. And let's also come in here and scrap all of this. And then when I come into my app, we're going to get rid of everything except for the actual app. So basically, I'm getting rid of all the styling and all the elements that are present in the app. All right, there we go. Maybe let's also go ahead and change the title of this. Instead of Vite app, we could call this something like card component. All right, now let's kind of do one thing at a time. And if you remember, as we looked at that Figma document, we had this badge that was its own little thing. So let's kind of treat that separately. I'm going to create a folder in here. We're going to call this components. And then inside here, I will call this badge.tsx, right? Now, I have a couple extensions that will help me out, or a couple kind of customizations. First of all, I can look for ES7 something. It should show up. Okay, here we go. This ES7 React Redux React Native snippets. And there's a couple things you'll want to know about this. If I open up my settings here by hitting Command and comma, I can then look for React. And let's see, snippets. And what I want... Let's see where I can find this. Well, one thing I want to do is include in my emit the languages JavaScript and have JavaScript React be a possibility there. That way I can use Emmet inside of JSX. So that's one thing I meant to note. The other thing I'm not seeing here, oh, right here, React snippets, import React on top. So you used to have to do this. You don't have to do this anymore. So I'm going to get rid of this right here. And that way when I use these snippets, I don't have to worry about that. All right, looks like I have to restart VS Code. So let's do that and close this down. Let's see, is my server dead? Nope, server's still living. All right. So now I can come back over here and use one of those React snippets. So if I do RAFCE and then hit enter, it should put this all in here. If I didn't change that, it would have import React from React or whatever up here, and you don't need that anymore. All right, so I think that's everything I wanted to show you there. Let's go ahead and just think about this badge itself. Now there are some elements in HTML that help us out here, and one of them is the small element. And this will allow us to style everything that's small on our site without having to add some kind of weird class. Just use the tag itself. Now I know I'm going to want to take in just two things here. If you remember from the demo, we had both the text and then we also had whether or not it was filled. So we can take in both of those here, and you see that we actually need to type these because we haven't yet. So let's go ahead and open up the sidebar, and why don't we just do this? I'll just create a file at the top level named types.ts. Here's where I will export some interfaces. So I'll do interface, and this one is just going to be called badge. Actually, let's do badge interface just to keep it separate from everything else. And then in here, we'll have two things. We have the text, and this will be a string. And then we'll also have the filled, and this will be a Boolean. Then we should be able to come in here and say import, and this will be a named import since it was a named export, and that was just badge interface. And in fact, you see it's already guessing it for me, and I can just hit tab, and it should auto-populate all that for me. Then right after these two deconstructed parameters, I can come in here and just type badge interface like that. So now it knows that this should be a text, and this should be a Boolean. So let's do the easy one first. We'll say text like this, and let's see, I guess we could have filled be optional. Let's just do it like that for now. And so there we go. So now I can pass in text. This is optional, but you can see how, so it can be undefined or Boolean, and it's never used so far. Let's go ahead and open up app.tsx, and I'm going to start typing badge and hopefully pull this in. Yep, pulled it in right up top there. Perfect. Now the advantage of using something like TypeScript is the error checking. You can see it's red underlined, and if I hover over this, it tells me that I'm missing the text property, and that's required. And it doesn't tell me anything about the other one except up here it says that it needs to be filled, but it's not required. So this helps me really quickly see what I need to add to each of these components. So I can come in here and say text, and I can give it something like, I don't know, like new post or something like that. All right, so there we go, and you can see how it pulls in right up top here. So perfect. Now we are going to do a couple styling things so this looks a little bit better, but first of all, let's go ahead and handle that other possible property, which is filled. So right over here. Now I'm going to pass this in as a class, but it will be optional because it doesn't have to be there in the actual interface. So class name here, and then inside of brackets actually, because we're going to be doing some interpolating here, I'm going to simply pass in a template string, and we'll say styles.badge. Now the reason I'm doing that to start with is because we're actually going to have some styles we're going to pull in through a CSS module. So most of the things we're going to be doing are going to be scoped to modules. That way they stay with the single component. So let's go ahead and make that module. We're not going to add anything to it yet, but under here I can just say new file and say badge.module.css. Now the reason to do a module is because it gives you scoping to this. So I could have something like a badge class like that, and maybe I have it say like background color blue. All right, for now. I'll come back over this way to this badge TSX, and now this styles I need to get in here. So I'm going to say import, and then I'll just call it styles. You can call it whatever you want. By default, it just exports it all as default, so you can name it whatever you want. You can name it S if you want, all right? But I'll do styles from, and then this is the same directory, badge.module.css. You can see now that that pulls in right over here, and I'm getting my styles dot, because this is an object I'm pulling in, the badge class name. And that corresponds to this right here. If I were to look inside here, again, the reason I'm doing this with a module is because it's going to scope it to this exact component. If I did this in just a normal CSS file, it would actually be a global declaration in CSS, and I don't want that. I want it to stay just with this module. All right, so there we go. The reason I put this in template strings, though, is because we're going to have some interpolated values in here. So probably the easiest way to do this would be to come up here and we could say const like filled class or something like that. So to determine whether or not it would show. And then I can just say, if it's filled, then give me styles.filled. Otherwise, give me an empty string. then I can just add that same thing just down here like this, filled class. All right, so after it's evaluated this, it will basically pass in an empty string, or it will pass in this right here to give me access to what will eventually be a filled class. So filled, we could say like color is red. All right, something horrible. All right, so here we go. Let's come back over here to my app.tsx, and let's see. Here we'll pass in filled, and we'll set this to true, this, and now you see I've got red text, which is delightful. All right, so that's a good starting point. We took our time, but we got one component up, and it gave me a chance to explain CSS modules and some of the TypeScript that we're going to be using throughout this project. Next, what I want to do is to declare some global CSS values. So let's come over here to our index.css. We're going to start with just a basic clear. Now, to save us a little bit of time, I'm going to go ahead and paste a lot of these things in. Let's close the sidebar just to make it easier to see, because most of this isn't difficult. It's just the process of kind of styling things. So we're going to remove all margin and padding, letting parents mostly control the spacing between their children, and set the box sizing to border box. Next, I'm going to declare the root, and inside here I'm going to declare several kind of default values we're going to use throughout the project. So to start with, I'll have a bunch of font properties. So these are font sizes. I like to declare these as like 200, and that would be kind of the small. I could have a 100 even being smaller than that, but 400 is kind of my normal. So it looks like we're going to keep 400 around 20, and I think that corresponds to the project itself. I think this is supposed to be something more like 20, if I remember correctly, and then the normal is 22. You can see for a big font size, I've got 32 pixels. Then I've got some line height properties, so line height 1 or line height 1.1 or line height 1.4, and that kind of depends on what we're doing. All right, next I've got a bunch of colors, and I'm going to declare these as CSS variables without any kind of wrappers for HSL. And I'll show you why I'm going to do that in a second, but I like to do that in my projects because it lets me set up some transparencies on the fly. Next, I've got some utilities. Here we've got some spacing elements, so we're going to clamp things, and this means it will be as small as 0.04 rem or 0.4 rem and as large as 0.8 rem, and this is kind of the dynamic value inside here. Same thing with medium and then large. We've got a content width and then some rounding properties as well. All right, next, let's go ahead and set some base values for the body. And I'll, again, paste these in and talk you through these. So we're going to put everything in the middle. We want it to be min height of 100%. We're setting the padding to one of our CSS variables, the font family here to enter, and we need to actually pull in this font, which we'll do in just a second. And then font size and line height, all of this is, we're just setting defaults. These are just font things that will help us be a little bit more performant. And then I'm setting the background color to my background and my color of my text to my text variable up top here. And notice, like I mentioned a second ago, that all of these color properties I'm now wrapping in HSL. So I'm pulling in the variable and dumping it directly in an HSL function. And that means if I wanted to, I could come in here, for instance, and I could type something like 0.2, and that does make a difference, but it's really hard to see because of how light this was already. So if I were to change this to something like accent, let's see, accent, I think that will be more obvious. So there's kind of the opaque version, and there's the full version. And you can see that all it takes is adding that to it, and I can dynamically create these variables. That's why I do it that way. So background, let's switch that back and remove that. All right, next, there's a couple other kind of utility functions, I guess we'd call them, that we're going to add. So the H1 through H6, we're going to set all those to font weight of 600. We're setting the line height to 1.1 and the font size to my largest font possible. I've also got all the small tags. We're going to make those all font size smaller, and then we're going to set the line height to 1. And then next we'll have uppercase, just to transform things. We'll have stack large, stack medium, and stack small. Now, all these do is basically set everything in grid and set the spacing, these gaps here, to whatever size those need to be. Most of the time I have vertical stacks in cards, and so for me it's easy to keep those consistent just by using some utility classes. All right, so that's all we're going to do for the global styling. And again, because this is declared in a CSS file, and at the index, then this means it will be available everywhere else throughout my project. You can see how already my badge has adjusted to the font size. Now, I do want to go ahead and pull up the fonts, and I'm going to pull up Enter. This is just a program I have called Raycast, and you can install plugins, and one of those I have is the Google Fonts. So I'm going to go ahead and click this, and what I need is the 400 and the 600. And if I Command K, it gives me options here. So let's just copy this right here. All right, now I'm going to jump over to the index and paste that in. Let's just do it below here. And that way now I'm getting this in. Now I already have it on my machine, so it was already using it, but that way you can use it too if you don't have it on your machine. All right, so I'm going to close that down. We don't need that anymore. We are going to need to do some stuff with the app. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the app itself, this would be a class. This is the CSS file, and see, I guess we'll just leave this as a CSS file because I'm just going to have a couple of things in here. So here, as we move things around, we want to make sure that everything stays in the center inside of this app. So I'm going to say display grid and place items center. And then I'm going to actually create another wrapper around all the cards called card container. This card container will be display of flex, and then we'll do flex wrap of wrap. That way the cards will wrap around on smaller screen sizes. And then I'll say align items, flex start. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because if you don't do that, when we have these cards, if one of them's longer than the others, it will just stretch out all the contents so that by default, they all stretch out to the same height, which will kind of distort the card. So I want them to stay at the top and only take up the room that they need. Finally, I'm going to set a gap here, and we'll use our var of space large. And that's, again, one of those variables we set up top, and that way it will adjust for us. Now, we don't yet have any of this going on because the card container isn't there yet. So let's go ahead and add that just inside here. So I'm going to grab all of this. Actually, let's just grab it like this, hit Command-Shift-P and wrap with abbreviation, and I'll say dot card container. All right, eventually the card will be inside of that, but you can see if I were to add a bunch of these, it's going to just set these out as flex items. And then if I move them smaller, eventually, let's see, let's just use the dev tools. It should make them to where they wrap around, and they do. All right, cool. Let's close this down and get rid of these extra badges we don't need. And now let's go ahead and style the badge a little bit more now that we've got some of our colors and things like that set up. So I'll come over here to the badge module, and let's actually do what we want here. So first of all, I'm going to set some padding on here, and we could use our variables. In this case, it's just going to be in this one use case. So I'm going to set it to 0.5 EM and then 1 EM. So that's left and right and up and down, or the reverse, up and down and then left and right. And then let's set a border on this. We may not have a border visible if it's filled, but we'll always have it there, and that way we don't have to adjust the size based on that. So we'll set it to 0.1 EM solid, and then I'll set this to my HSL of accent 2, and that should be that orange color. Now by default, I don't want it to be filled, and that way the filled class can set all of that. So I'm going to set this to my HSL of background, just like that, and that way you can see it pull in. Then let's go ahead and get rid of this, and we'll change this to accent, so that the text itself by default is going to be actually accent 2, I think. It's being overridden right now by that filled class, but we'll change that in a second. I think there's just two other things we're going to need here. One is we're going to need this to be a border radius, and this will be a var of round small. Again, this is one of those variables we set up top, and it takes on that rounding effect. And then eventually this is going to be a flex child, rather than in this case, it's just an inline item. And when that becomes the case, it's going to stretch out to fill its whole parent. So one of the ways we can fix that is setting a max width here to max content. And that way it always takes up the max content it needs and no more than that. Now finally, let's come down here. Actually, let's just copy these right here, because when it's filled, we're going to switch this up. When it's filled, we're going to set this to accent of 2, and when it's filled, we're going to set this to background. There we go. You can see how that shows perfectly for us. Now that means if I were to come back over here to my app and change this to false, or just not have it altogether, either way, it should make it just empty like it is right there, and that should correspond to what we've got over this way. Now I also need this to be uppercase, so that's one other thing to think about. So let's come over here, and I could just add this as uppercase like that, and that way it's going to be uppercase automatically. All right, so I think that badge component is basically done, and everything is scoped to this module as far as the CSS is concerned. The next thing let's work on is the button. So let's pull up the sidebar here, and maybe let's just copy this. So I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it in here, and we'll just say button.tsx. That means I need to switch around all of these. Let's see. Let's just grab all those, Command-Shift-L, and change these to button. And eventually we're going to have to create this because right now it's yelling at us. Our button interface, let's get rid of all this. Actually, I think I might need that as well, but maybe let's get rid of this for now. This is actually going to be an anchor tag, so we'll get back around to that. But for now, let's just say like link, or how about button, something like that. And then we need to create this interface. So let's see, let's close this down. Let's look at interface, or what did I call those, types? And let's create another one. So here we go. We're going to change this around to button interface. And we got to think through what we need in here. Now, if I move back over here to Figma, you can see that if I were to click in on this button, I basically want to have the interface declare all of these things for me. So I need to know if it's filled or not, what type it is, what the button text is, whether or not the icon shows, and then which icon it shows. All right, so we can control these two together, but the rest of those we're going to need separate. So let's move back over this way. We'll also need an href too. We shouldn't forget that. So we'll have the text as string, that's fine. We will have a filled Boolean as well. Let's set the type. This would be like primary or secondary. We're going to set this to a type of string, and then we'll have an href, and this is also going to be a type of string. And then we're going to have one other thing, which is the icon itself. Now, with both the icon and the filled, let's bring this down here. These are both going to be optional because we may not want an icon. This is going to be set to JSX.element. All right, and this is an interface that comes along with React, and so that way, or with JSX, and so that way we can declare, hey, we're passing in an element here. Now, if I move back over to my button, it looks like this error has disappeared. There we go. But I do need to go ahead and pull in a few other things. So I've got my type. I've got my, and if I can't remember, I can hit Control Option or Control Spacebar, and it will show me. So href, and then I've also got my icon as well. So it should pull all those in. Now, the easy one here is text, so I can just switch that out for text right there, and now the text should show. Let's go ahead and pull in this app. Actually, let's put something on the screen so we can actually see what we're doing here. So I'm going to type button and then hit tab, and that should auto-complete it up top here. There you go right there. And you can see I'm getting yelled at because I need to include several things, text, type, and href. So let's come down here and say text. We'll say button, and then we've got, what was another one? Hit Control Spacebar again. I've got href, and let's just set that to $, and then I've also got type, and let's set this to primary, like that. All right, now it's asking us to have a module in CSS, which we don't yet have for this, so let's go ahead and copy this over, and we'll change this to button.module, and we can get rid of the copy. There we go, and save that. Save that. Our error should go away. All right, so back to the button itself, which is right over here. We got the text coming in. That's good. Somehow it is not returning this for me visibly, at least not where I can see it. We'll get around to that in a second. The other things we want to do is we want to set some classes on here. So class name. And once again, we're going to put this in a template string. We'll have our styles.button, which is what we'll eventually have is a class of button inside of there. And then we're also going to have the type of button. And here, again, we're going to pull from our styles module, and then we'll have the type be dynamically declared. To dynamically declare something, you can just put it inside of brackets like this, and we'll just have the type come in. So here you go. This is just normal JavaScript. When you're accessing an object property where it can be different values depending what's passed in. If you pass it in like this, it can be dynamic. And then finally, we're going to have the same filled class. So let's just call it filled class like that and pull that in. Now we can have two things in here. We can have the text, but you might remember we can also have the icon. So let's space this out like this, and we'll have the text inside. Actually, let's do it inside of a span element here. And then just below here is where we're going to pass in our icon. Now this icon may or may not exist, so if it doesn't exist, nothing will show up here. If it does exist, it will pop in this JSX element directly in here. And then to my eye, I think the last thing we need to do here, and you can see how each of these things are getting progressively not grayed out, but this one is still grayed out because we haven't used it. We just need to add in our href directly in here. So I think that should be set, and the button should be ready to go. Now before we style this in the module, let me make sure I've got button interface. That's all being exported properly. So it is coming in. Let's come back over here. Let's see, I wonder why this is not showing. Oh, there it goes. I just had to save it, I guess, one more time. And now we can go ahead and style it. So that's everything we need passed in. And let's say we actually might want to go ahead and pass in an icon just so we can play with that as well. What are the other things we can do? Filled. So let's set this to false for now. And then the other thing would be an icon. Now, we want to set this to a JSX element. And first of all, I want to actually import something. So let's come over here. We're going to look at heroicons.com. I'll jump into the documentation. I like these icons. They're made by the people who make Tailwind. And if I come down here somewhere, here we go, I can install them directly into my React project. So I'm going to open up my terminal and install them briefly here. And then I'll just go ahead and run the server again. That way it's back up and running. And you can see all I have to do is import them directly from Hero Icons. So let's grab this right here and let's see. Paste it in right up here, and this beaker icon now I can just access like a JSX element because that's exactly what it is. So I can come in here and say icon, and I can pass it the beaker icon. That means if I come back over this way, it should be showing. There it is, very large. That's great. Let's change this to something we might actually want to use. So like perhaps we would search for something like moon. Sure, moon icon. There we go. You can see as you start typing, it actually gives you suggestions. We might also want something with like money. Or is there finance? No, let's do airplane. There we go, paper airplane icon. That should pull in, and it pulls in down here. If I save it, there we go right here. So maybe we'd use this for like sending something with this button. All right, so let's move back over this way. Now that we've got everything pulled in, this button module, let's see, we're going to change this to button right here. We might keep some of this the same, so let's leave it alone for now. Here, what I want to do is make this as flexible as I can. So we're actually going to declare some local variables inside of here. So we're going to have the type, and we're going to set this to transparent by default. And then we'll also have a fill, and we're going to set this to transparent as well. Now, the reason I'm doing that is so that way I can basically change around what these variables point to based on whether or not stuff is filled or what type it gets passed. And it just reduces the amount of code I have to do and keeps everything scoped to these variables, these local variables. And next, I want this to be display of flex because I can have two items like this icon here. And if I do that, it should move over eventually. Right now, this fill is, I'm not sure where that icon went to, but it's somewhere. All right. Next, let's say align items center, and this keeps everything vertically spaced up and down exactly the same. Now here I want to have a gap, and I'm going to use my space, my space of small. Again, that's one of those variables we set up top. For the font size here, I want my var to be font size of 300. So that's a little bit smaller than my body font. And you can see it shrinks down just a touch. And then I actually want to set my line height as well. I want to set this different from my normal body font. So this would be line height of 1. Now I also need to set my text decoration here to none. And then I need to set a cursor of pointer. And that way when I come over here, I actually get this displaying for me. Now to some of these more complex properties, let's leave the padding alone. I don't mind that. And with it being M, you can see how it's the same padding technically as this, but because the font size is bigger, now the padding gets bigger. And that's one of the values of using something like M. Now when it comes to border itself, why don't we break these up into separate things? And that way we can just declare them as we need to. So let's set the border width to start with, and we're going to set that to 1 EM. And then we'll set the border style to solid, and then we'll set the border color, and here what I want to do is actually set it to my var of type. Now the reason I'm doing it like that is because basically what I'm going to be doing is starting it with transparent and then updating it later on depending on what type it is or what styling I pass it in the component. Now my border radius is very similar, so border radius, we're going to set this to var of round small, like that. And then I do want to transition on this because eventually we're going to have it transitioning basically between like hover states and things like that. So let's just do a transition on everything. So we'll do transition, and we'll do all, and then I'll do 500 milliseconds. And let's see, we can do a cubic Bezier curve, and I've just got one on my clipboard, so I'll paste that in here, and that way it's a little bit more dynamic. If I look down here, I've got a couple, let's see, let me make sure I don't have max width, so I can leave that there. I duplicated this, not noticing that I'd already done that. See, background color, we need to set this to our fill property. So we're going to start it again with basically nothing. So we're going to say var of fill, which would be transparent to start with. And let's copy this down and change the color, not to fill, but we're going to change this to our type. So if I save it here, everything should basically disappear because it's all transparent to start with. Now, just so you can see what's going on, let's change both of these briefly here to like black. And that way you can see them show up. The text is there as well, but at least you can see that there is something there. All right, we'll just adjust that as we get going. So down here, we're going to have the SVG inside of the button. We want to set a max height on here of 20 pixels, and that way it corresponds to the text height we have, because again, our text is 20 pixels. The other thing we could do, I guess, is come in here and say var font size of 300, and I think that should be the same. That way, if we change around the font size, it should update along with it. Now, so that we can actually see what's going on here, why don't we go ahead and declare the primary, because I think that's the type we passed in here. And now all we have to do is change around the type here to HSL of my var accent, like that. When I do that, everything should pull up automatically. I think this is overriding it for now, so let's get rid of that. Nope, that's not going on. What's the matter here? All right, it's yelling at us. All right, let me open this up over here. I'm not seeing any errors over this way. So let's restart the server and just hope that everything works. All right, at least we know it's not a React problem because it is showing up over here. And you can see we've got undefined, we've got a class. Okay, so we've got some things to work on when it comes to the component. So let's come over this way. Now we know. I'll come over here. Let's see, we've passed in primary. That should work. See, this needs to be primary like this, I think. There we go. All right, so that's the only problem here. Maybe what I could do is, I was going to say I could just to lowercase it over in the module. Maybe we should do that just to make sure it's working properly. And not in the module, in the actual button right here. So I think I should be able to come in here and say dot to lowercase, and that way it should work no matter what. So let's try that over here. If I pass in primary like that, yeah, so it works either way. That's probably a little safer, so let's do it like that. All right, I think all the rest of that should be just fine. So you can see now actually everything is showing as it's supposed to show. If I remove this, now everything should go invisible again because, again, I have to have either primary or secondary. Now the brilliance of setting it up this way is now I can come in here and just grab secondary, and we can change this to accent 2, just like that. And that means if I were to come back over this way and change this to secondary, now it'll actually just take on those colors instead, just changing around one little thing, which is this type. Now when it comes to filled, I need to go ahead and move this around, and what I want is to change my, let's actually pull this down here too. Now in this case, and stay with me here, what I'm going to do is set my fill to my var of type, because if it's filled, I know it has to have either primary or secondary. So in other words, it's going to already have these declared as like accent or accent 2. Now I'm going to just set my fill to whatever that color is, and again, this makes it incredibly dynamic. No matter what the color is though, I know that the text needs to be my white color. So if I come back over here and we change this to true, you can see now it takes on that property. Now if I come over here and change this to secondary, again, it's going to take that on as well. So all that is being controlled by those two little local variables, and that's the beauty of using CSS variables. Let's move back over this way. We've got a couple other things to do, and then we'll be done with this button component. So I'm going to grab the button focus state, and I'm going to set the outline to none. Now you should never do this unless you replace it, so let's replace it. So I'm going to grab button here, and I'm going to grab two different properties. It can be either the hover state or the focus visible state. And the focus visible state is when you tab to something. Now what I like to do is set a box shadow just to make it kind of a little bit fancy, I guess. And we're going to set this to 0, 0, and 0. So it's not going to have any kind of blur. It won't be up, down, left, right, or anything, but it will be ringed around it. We're going to set this to HSL of var, and we'll set this to my background. See, I think I got one too many parentheses. All right, and actually let's copy this down, put a comma in between them, and then put a semicolon at the end. The other thing I want is on the outside of this, we'll do something like, I don't know, 6 pixels, and we're going to set this to my type. So this should take on whatever the color is, like here, primary or secondary. Now, the reason I'm doing it like that is if I come in here and I hover over this, what I want it to do is actually pop this whole box shadow out. Now, I got myself in trouble here by copying this down because you can see that I'm wrapping this type in an HSL value, a wrapper, and then it's already being wrapped in HSL. So that's not going to work very well. So there we go. All right, now, again, the brilliance of all this, tying this to type, is that now we can just come around and change this to something like true, and we can set this to something like secondary, and the CSS will just adjust with us, including the color of that border. All right, that means our button component is totally done. All right, so we've just got the card itself left. Obviously, that's kind of the whole thing, but this is actually the hardest part right here, setting up these two little subcomponents. We'll also have that indicator component, but it's just going to be text we're passing in, so I think we'll just declare that on the actual card itself. So let's go ahead and close down all these other things. We don't need these anymore. I am going to go ahead and add an extra type, though. So we'll say export interface, and we'll call it like card interface. And here, what I'm going to want is several things. And again, I can pull over this way to see what I need. You can see I'm going to need the badge itself, this indicator, the image, the title, the subtitle, the body, and the button. And there might be a couple other things as we think through this. So let's go ahead and start at the top of the card. So we'll have the indicator like that. And then let's make this optional so that we don't have to pass it in. But if we do, it'll be a string. Now the badge itself, we don't have to pass in. Once again, we want that to be optional. We're going to pass this our badge interface. So everything that's connected to that badge interface will now be connected to this property, a badge on the card. Image, the same thing, except in this case, we're just going to pass it a string, and then we'll have a title, and this is going to be required, and we'll have this be a string. We'll also have a subtitle, and this is not required. Remember, we could toggle that on and off. We'll set this to a string, and then for body, we will also set this to a string. And finally, let's do our button. Let's just do it like that, and we'll pass it our button interface. So I think that's everything we need on this right here. That means we're ready to go ahead and create that. So if we come over here, let's create a new one here. We'll say card.tsx and then RAFCE and pull that in. All right, so there we go. And we're going to want to import that interface. Let's just grab it from over here. Let's see. Actually, let's grab all this because we'll just update that. The card right here. And we'll grab this and hit Command-Shift-L and grab both of those and say card. That way I've got my card module.css, which also means I need to have that. So card.module.css. All right, let's shut that down, pull this in over here, and there we go. So we can start using all these things inside here. Now I'm going to want to deconstruct all of these and apply them the card interface. All right, and if I go ahead and declare that first, now I can come in here, hit Control Space, and just add these one at a time. I don't have to remember what I had, just like that. All right, cool. So I've got all those set. If I were to come in here, first of all, I could pass in like the title, and again, that would be pulled in directly. Now, eventually, if I tried to do this, it would yell at us because I had a couple other things that were required, so I need to remember those. Let's first of all just switch this up, and again, let's use some semantic HTML. This would probably be an article, and then the card container itself would probably be a section. Article like that. And then if I came back over here, see this card container would probably be a section. And for now, let's go ahead and copy or comment out all of this. We'll eventually pull that back into our card. And then what I want to do is just pull in a card like this. If I start to type and hit tab, once again, it should import it up top, and it does. Let's get rid of this state. By the way, we don't need that, and we don't need this. All right, there we go, the card right there. And I got to close this off. And now it's going to tell me what I need. So I need a body. We'll say hi. I need a button. So I guess let's go ahead and just grab this right now since I've got it here. And we'll set my button to my button interface. And let's see, why is this yelling at me? It may just be that we don't have everything set up properly yet. So let's not worry about that for now. I'll come in here. What else do I need? I need a title. Hi. 2. All right, there we go. All right, and I think I know what it's doing here actually. I don't need to pass in the component because it's not a JSX element. I just pass in the things that that component needs. So I should be able to come in here like this, and I think that should take care of our problems. I just need to add some commas in here, and then I need to change out all these because this is just an object I'm passing in like that. Because it's an object, I can just pass these things, directly in here. And I think that should take care of all of our errors. Okay, there we go. So what we're doing is passing in basically the properties that are needed here, and I can pass them in as an object, and then I'll grab them, deconstruct them over in the card component. All right, so that was a lot of work just to get these things being pulled in properly, but now the card is actually showing up. So come over this way. Let's construct this card as we want it to be. So actually the first thing I want is to have a class name up here. And again, I'm going to have this as a template string because I always want it to have a stack of large. That was our spacing variable that we set up at the beginning that spaces this out in kind of a large way. So it'll be display grid with that large gap between it. Then I want my styles.card is the style I'm going to apply to the entire card itself. Now in here, I'm going to have an indicator if it's visible. So the way you declare this is say indicator. And then you can do it a couple of ways, but I'll just use this logical and then say if that is, then what I want is to have a small tag inside here. And I guess let's do this. Let's do small dot so I can apply a class name here. And we'll do styles because what I want is actually I should have just typed this out, right? Styles.indicator. All right, eventually that's what I would want. Now inside here, I'd actually want my indicator text. So just to make sure that's clear, what we did, we said, hey, if this is there, then go ahead and apply this tag or add this tag here. If it's not there, then don't add this tag or this element there. And we're actually going to do the same thing with the badge, except in this case, what I want to do is, let's go ahead and get rid of this. What I want is to pass in my badge. So actually, I think we can do this all in one line. So if I say badge like this, it should auto import that when I hit tab, and it does. And I need some text on here. And the text is just going to come from that object that I will pass in eventually. And it'll be badge.text. And then we'll have filled, and this will be badge.filled. All right, if that doesn't make sense, let me go ahead and close this out, and then let's add it so that you can see it work in real life. All right, so there we go. Finally got that all set up. All right, now it's yelling at me. Let's see. It needs this module. Well, that's because this is named css.css. All right, that's not going to help anyone, so let's get rid of one of those CSSs, and there we go. All right, now I need a card on here, and then I also need an indicator. This is just kind of a placeholder so we remember what we need to add. All right, that should take care of our problems over there. And let's see, do we still have an issue? I don't think we do, so let's go ahead and just get the server back up and running. Maybe we do. No, we'll figure it out, okay? So let's come back over to our app, and let's go ahead and pass in a couple other things, just so you can see the badge actually working. So here, if we're going to pass this in, we'll pass it in like we did with the button, where we just pass in the props we need. So in this case, we need text. We'll pass this in as like hi or something like that. And then we'll pass in, oh, this is an object. So hi. And then we'll pass in filled or not. So filled. And because we set that up before, we can just say like false or true. I guess, so we can see a difference. You can see how it just updates automatically for us. So this is being passed in down here. Then the card receives these, and it receives them inside of this object. And then we pull these properties out, the dot text and the dot filled, and pass those on to the badge itself. Now we're going to have something similar with the image because, once again, the image itself is optional. They don't have to pass one in. So if they do pass one in, we'll have a logical and here. Then we're going to have an image tag, and the source will point to the image that was passed in. The alt, for now, we'll just say like random image, all right, because I don't know what that is. That might be a property we want to add to the image, so you can decide what that alt should be. And then for the class name, in this case, I just want to pass it directly to my module here like this, and we'll do styles.image is what we're going to call it. The other nice thing about using modules is you don't have to come up with crazy class names. You just do like image, and because it's scoped to this, that works just fine. Now let's move over this way so we can actually see that in action. So I'm going to say image here, and this just needs to be a string. And I'm just going to use a random image from Unsplash. So this could be anything, but it pulls in right over there. Okay, and it's massive. That's all right. We'll figure that out. So again, that string is coming into the card itself, and I'm pulling that in up top here, the image. And then I'm saying if it exists, go ahead and show it to me down here. That means if I were to come down here and if I were to remove this, now it's also gone from the card itself. So maybe let's keep it like that for now and fill out the rest of this card, and then we'll come back in and style that. The next section here is going to be our title. And if I were to move back over to the Figma, it's this section right here. So title, body, and then button. That's what we've got left. So let's add that all inside of a stack. We're going to call stack small. And again, we have those classes set up at the beginning, so that way we get consistent spacing without having to style it in each and every component on the site. Now I'm assuming if this is an article that it's probably an H3 because it's inside of a section that would have its own heading. So we could say something like H3 and give it a class name. Actually, let's just do H3 for now because I'm going to want my class name to be, again, this would be a module. So I'm going to say styles dot, and then I'm just going to call this title. And then inside here, we'll have the title. Now that's always going to be there because it's required, but I do have a subtitle that is not required. So subtitle, and what I want to check is if that thing exists. So if it exists, then once again, we're going to do a logical and I'm going to have this in a small tag because I do want it to be that small type text, and that way I don't have to do as much styling. I come in here with my class name like that, and I want styles.subtitle. And in here, I want subtitle. All right, there we go. Let's see. Cannot find subtitle. I must not have added it up here. So subtitle. And it looks like maybe I didn't put it in my interface, so that might be why. So you see title, subtitle. I definitely put it there. Oh, I just need a comma. Okay, there we go. So if I have a subtitle, go ahead and place it there. Now outside of here, we want a paragraph, and this is going to be where my body is shown. So we'll come in here and add a class name. And here, what I want is styles.body, and that's how we'll style that. Now finally here, we're going to pull in our button component that we've already written, and we're going to go ahead and just apply all the properties to that get pulled in. So we'll say filled is equal to button.filled. Type is going to be equal to button.typed. And again, what I'm doing is just passing in everything from the object that's been passed in here. Remember, that's how we passed it in the card itself. All right, let me do the rest of these and I'll be right back with you. All right, so there you go. We got the entire card done. All right, so now all we have to do is now use it. So let's talk through real quickly what we're doing here. If I come over this way, let's go ahead and add this image back over here. And then what else can we do? We can add an indicator. So maybe we say like sold. And then do we have anything else? The subtitle, we could be like great subtitle. Now, throughout this video, you may be frustrated that I've got some single quotes and some double quotes. Well, that's something linting should take care of for me. I don't have that set up on this project, so I don't really worry about that. I just let my linter figure that out. So if that really frustrates you, I'm sorry. All right, back over here to our card. Now you can see I've got this indicator, I've got the badge, I've got my image, I've got my head title, my subtitle, my body, and my button. And all of this responds just as you'd expect. So the last thing we've got to do really is just to style the card itself. This actually won't take that much work. This is a flex child, so we want to think about that. We want it to grow if it can and shrink like it's supposed to, and then we'll set it to 300 pixels at its width. Now, I do want this to be position of relative, so that way I can position that indicator at position absolute as needed. The background color, I want to set this to my HSL var of background. That way it takes on the same background color as the rest of my site. Now, so that we can actually see what's going on, we need to get that image a little bit smaller. So let's grab our image and set the width to 100% and the max width to 100%. And then I'm going to go ahead and set an aspect ratio on here. Aspect ratio, we'll do 16 by like 12, something like that. And obviously we need to set an object fit to cover, and that way it looks nicer. All right. Finally, let's set a border radius, because this is what we had on the original project, to our var of rounded, or round, I think it was, medium. All right, so there we go. So these are small rounding, this is the medium rounding, and the card itself will eventually have a large rounding. So there we go. Now, to kind of separate this off from its background, I want to do a couple of things here. First of all, I want to set the, I want to give it a box shadow. So we'll say box shadow. We'll do over to the right 2 pixels, down 2 pixels, 40 pixels of blur. And then I want an HSL here of my muted color. And I want to set this to an opacity of 0.4. That's, I think, the only time perhaps in this project where I actually use that opacity, but I like setting it up that way so I've got the flexibility. Let's give this some padding, and we're going to use one of those variables of space large, just like that, and that way it's got some nice padding around it. We'll also set the border radius. We'll set this to my var of round large, and that way it takes on a rounded effect just like our design. Now, whenever I've got this kind of new morphic design, I like to go ahead and add like a bright border up here and down below, and that way it gives it a little bit more of like depth to it. So we'll say border top. Let's just do like 0.1 EM, because some of this will depend on the font size and all that kind of stuff. So it will adjust for that. So we'll do left and top. If I save that, you see we get this nice little rounded border, and it just makes it pop a little bit more, look a little bit more realistic. Maybe I could even make this a little bit less. There we go. All right, so it's a little darker around the bottom there. I think the last thing I want to do is set a max width here. And I've got a variable called content that we set up at the very beginning that's like 60 characters wide or something like that. And that's based on my font size. And so this will basically set the cap of the card size. Now, while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and copy this and add a class of body. That was the body of the text itself. And I want to also set that to a max width of content. That kind of double checks it to make sure that it's only ever going to get this big, even if the text itself is smaller than the max content. And that means the last thing I've got to do is just to style the indicator. So we'll say position absolute, and then I want this to be right of 0. Background color, we don't have this changing in the design based on the user's preference. We could obviously add that as well, but we're just going to set this to accent. And then the color here will be my HSL of background. That way you can actually see the text. Now, I want this to be border radius, and I've got a variable that's round full, which is just a V max, I think, that we set up at the very beginning. And I want to set an aspect ratio on here. This guarantees that it's always going to be 1/1 or a complete circle. Now, to get everything to stay in the center, I want to say display of grid and then place items center. That should put it in the middle. And then let's give it some padding. We'll do space, space of small, just like that. Now, I need to actually move it up and over to the right. So the easiest way to do that is with the transform property. And that way I don't have to kind of calculate it manually with this the right top and all that kind of stuff. So I can just set it in the very top right and then translate, and I can just do 50% and negative 50%. There we go, it moves up top there. All right, now there it is, that's the card completed. Now the cool thing about this component is now it's totally reusable. We can reuse it in a bunch of different ways. So if I come over here, let's get rid of all this because we don't need that anymore. But I can have multiple cards and they can all say different things. So let's copy this down, maybe a few more times. Now I've got 3 of them and they should stack up nicely if I need them to. There we go. And they snap down when they can. And I can just adjust each of these independently. So for instance, maybe I'd come in here and I'd say something like 500 times 400. That gives me a different image on this one. Let's see, yeah, down here. So if you give it a specific size, it'll try to retrieve something like that. So here I could say, I don't know, I've got a lorem ipsum generator. So let's copy that and paste that in there. So now I've got a longer text here, and maybe I want to have this title say something like, this is a great photo. All right. And then the badge itself would be like new photo alert. Maybe in this case, this would be set to false. And again, all this is just controllable on this one card component. It's going to worry about passing all those things down as they need to. This could say new over here. This subtitle could be like, get your photo now. And maybe we change out this paper airplane icon. So let's add another one. Is there like a camera? Yeah, let's use camera icon. All right, so I can come down here. Let's see, where were we at? Right here. So I can just paste that in, and now I've got a different icon here. And maybe on this third one, I don't want an icon at all. So I can just remove this altogether, and I think that should work. Yeah, there you go. And let's change this one to primary, and maybe we set the field to false. And that way it's false down there. And let's see, let's not have a badge on this one, and maybe not an image either. And maybe we get rid of the indicator altogether and no subtitle. So that's as minimal as it can be. It just has those three things. This one has everything, but they're styled a little bit differently. Maybe I come up top here and let's change that around some more. So maybe here, let's not have a subtitle. Let's have the indicator, sure, we'll have it stay on sold. This one will be set to false for that field. And maybe we set this to primary as well and leave it at filled. And let's see, let's have the title say something like read post, post now. And that means this could say something like read post. All right, and then let's change out this paper icon one more time. And here, let's say like, is there like an article? Document maybe. So there we go, document icon. Let's grab this and add this down here. Oops, like that. So there you go, read post like that. And then maybe we have like a preview of what that post is. So I can come in here to the body and again, generate some paragraphs and paste those in maybe a couple times like that. Right, there we go. And all that is by default. We could say, I guess let's change this one more thing here. We'll say like new post. All right, so there we go. You can see how very easily we can just adjust for these and dynamically create all this stuff. And we did all this using React and JavaScript. And you can see how TypeScript is so helpful because it gives us access to all those little micro properties that we would have to otherwise go look up in the components themselves. Whether you watched the original design video or you just jumped in here and started coding with me, either way, I hope you really learned a lot and it was enjoyable for you. If you did enjoy it, I'd really appreciate it if you leave me a like. Thanks so much to all my Patreons who have supported me. I've got 3 now, and that's such a joy to have. If you'd like to be part of that crew, you can check out that in the description. I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Happy coding.